Hello and welcome to the Life After Diets podcast. I'm Sarah Dosanjh, psychotherapist and author of the book, I Can't Stop Eating.
And I'm Stefanie Michele, binge recovery health coach. If you feel out of control around food, we get it because we've been there.
Thank you for joining our conversations about how to make peace with food and feel more comfortable in our bodies.
Now on to this week's episode.
Hey you.
Hey you.
How did you know I was talking to you, Steph? I was talking to the listeners then.
How do you know I was talking back?
Touche. I
was though.
So today we have decided to talk about numbing, using food to numb. We've touched on this in other episodes, but it's a big topic that I think many people will relate to. So we thought it was worth dedicating a whole episode to.
It's more for the permitters, right?
Yes.
More so, I think, when we're ring true, we talk a lot about restriction. I think we talk evenly about it. I probably talk more about restriction. I think where restriction can be used to numb, we're talking about where we're using food to do that.
Yes.
Yeah.
We're talking about numbing.
That's true.
Do we kill two birds with the one stone and just say that restricting to numb and eating to numb are kind of the same?
They're two sides of the same coin, as we like to say.
Yeah. Someone said to me once, and they were a permitter, and they said, the only difference is I stuff, they starve.
Yeah.
That always stayed in my mind because I love a bit of alliteration. That's why I invited you to be my podcast co-host.
Is it?
Yes.
You thought I was good at alliteration? Oh.
No, because of our names. I just thought you're so skilled with your alliteration.
You picked up on that, did you?
I did.
Yeah,
So numbing. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Numbing. This one is, I think, a big one for me. And I think it's one you've gone through as well.
Yeah.
Yeah. You seem to have had a lot of cycles with your eating. You've had the full.
I really have run the full gamut. And I can attest to using both. They both serve the same purpose. And I'll also say that there were times in my life, it's not like you choose which one, because I remember being like, why can't I go back to using restriction as my numbing agent? It's not like you choose. I think it chooses you.
Yes. I think that's quite profound, what you just said there, Steph, about it choosing you. I see that a lot with those who have restricted to numb, and then they can't restrict anymore, and they're using food to numb, and they wish they could get back to the other. It doesn't feel like a choice, and I guess that's the difference, isn't it, between using food to try and feel better and using food or lack of food to not feel. Would you say it's the same, that numbing is the same as just not feeling, or do you think numbing is something different in and of itself? Is there a nuance there that's worth?
It's escaping to me. I think of that. I resonate more with that word than numbing, because I could feel pretty strongly and eat to numb. I don't know that it worked, but it was a way of trying to escape it. I never personally felt like it was working. Like, I never felt like food actually numbed much. I just wanted it to. Did you feel like it worked for you?
Yes, I did.
Really?
Yes, I did. Yes. And I can remember times choosing certain foods because for me, when I think about numbing, I'm reminded of almost trying to make my body as heavy as possible. Like, I want that heavy feeling in my stomach. I mean, I say I want it. The part of me that wants to numb would want it. Another part of me would hate that feeling. So it was a real conflict. The word that came to mind then actually was stillness. Like, it just made everything, I was going to say slow down, but it wasn't even that things were fast. It was just, it got rid of the itchiness and the agitation. It wasn't a pleasant feeling, but it was preferable to feeling agitated.
I get that. And I think I've had that experience. But I think more so, it's actually exacerbated the agitation for me. I think for in a moment, it could feel like literally as you're eating, there's like that but to me, it was almost like feeding a fire. It was making it bigger in my case. So it didn't feel like it was working. And yet you'd wonder, why would you keep doing it then? But I think that sometimes, and maybe this is a different episode, but food can serve the purpose of numbing as much as it can serve the purpose of feeling. So where you're talking about wanting to feel that heaviness in your stomach, or that something in you was craving that's feeling too, right? So like sometimes if you experience emotions as as really ungrounded untetheredness, that can become something to feel. Like, I wanna feel like I'm here. I need to feel like I'm rooted in this in the ground. To me, when you said that, I was like, "Yeah, that feeling feels like a safer place to be," but in a way that makes me feel like I'm actually here. It makes me feel like something is real, as opposed to a numbing.
I hear the difference there. I also think when you use the word escape, what that made me think of was the kind of slow binge. So for me, escape was about wanting to eat over a longer period of time. Like I want the sensation of eating to go on for as long as possible. So in those situations, I would have chosen foods that were slower to eat and slower to fill me up. So kinds of foods that I might melt in my mouth, as
Mm,
opposed to when I was in that state. Again, the word numbing, that feeling to me, it's a change of emotional state with the more frantic binging, that heaviness I was seeking. But for me, the heaviness still feels like a type of numbing, and I almost think that that numbing is a feeling, but numbing still feels like the closest word I can find to what that feeling actually was.
so when you numbed, or when you would use food in that way, what happened? Can you give an example of this?
Well, it was more in the aftermath. So this is why I might think of it more like numbing as opposed to escape. Because when the eating had finished, it was like that word food coma comes to mind. Like I'm tired, I'm checked out, which was different to the escape. The escape only worked while I was actually eating. I was escaping with the slow binge. But the minute the food stopped,
Mm,
I was back in the room. The other kind of eating, I wasn't, and it would go on longer. And there were times sort of early on, there would at some point come some catastrophizing afterwards about what I did. But there
yeah.
definitely got to a stage where, and many cycles of like, I just don't even care. Like I'm
Yes.
sad that I'm doing this and I feel a lot of shame and guilt about what I'm doing to myself and I feel out of control. But it doesn't feel like anything else is possible for me. Like I don't care.
Yeah. It brings up different feelings. And I think that's part of its appeal, right? So, for those of us who numb or numbed to distract from a large so for example, I because we were just talking about this prior to recording, thinking about my time in London where this is the last time I was in London, right? So this is 20 some odd years ago. And I was in the depths of my depression. As I've mentioned before in the podcast, I had a friendship breakup while I was there. I mean, I was really having major emotional upheaval, and I didn't know how to cope with that at all. I had no sense of self. I had no ground. I feel like I was an astronaut floating around in outer space. And then I had to go to class, and I would I mean, it was like the last thing in the world I wanted to do. And I think I didn't go many times, but I would sometimes attempt to go. And there was this walk from my flat to the I was gonna say the subway. And now I've lost it.
Tube.
The tube.
Yeah.
Ah! Um, and on that route was a Starbucks. Why I picked a Starbucks, couldn't even pick anything local, but it was a Starbucks, and I would watch my feet walk in, and I would get a frappuccino and a big muffin or a big, uh, block of granola bar, like this, the things they would make, and I mean, and I would get that, and I would either continue walking to the tube as I ate it, or I would sit down, eat it, and then decide there's no way I could go to class and walk back home. And as this would happen, I it was a way of me escaping the reality of my moment 100%, but it also gave me more angry energy at myself that then I could use in a different way. At least I know what to do with that. So after I would finish the frappuccino, I remember the feeling in your stomach of having just had this like heavy drink plus the granola, which is quite dense, and then I would be like, oh, and then I would be so angry at myself. And all of a sudden, I didn't have to think anymore about the direness of my situation and how much I was desperate to not be there and be me. But I was now really angry and really disgusted at myself, and so it that's why I mean, like, numbing, I don't know, because it numbed out one set of emotions that I didn't know what to do with, but and it brought up another one that maybe I did know what to do with. I understood anger and self-disgust, and so I gave it a new place to go, but I never felt like except for occasional times, I never felt like I was numbing it. There were times you'd reach, yes, where I'd be like, I don't even care. I don't care about anything. And that was more of a actually like a worse place to be. I think that that was when I really was giving up on myself and I didn't have the energy anymore. I was like more of that freeze state. But I think that the actual more of the active numbing was more to take emotions that I was less comfortable with and to translate them into emotions that I was more comfortable with, um, and escape those.
Do you know what the emotions were that you were trying to escape? If you were gonna try to name and pinpoint what they might have been?
I just know how it feels. Like,
Mm.
um, rejection was one, loneliness for sure, fear, fear. I
Mhm.
hate fear. I don't even know why it's coming up right now. Like it was fear. It was an intense fear, and I don't know of what.
Mm.
Um, but that is what I am very uncomfortable with fear.
Well, it's a fear that's not imminent, so you can't deal with the emotion
Yeah.
itself because in that moment, there's nothing active happening to put the fear on. It sounds like a bigger existential
Yes,
fear.
yes, and that's why I hate that. I would much like that's where we've talked about the difference between an acute emotion and more of those low level ones, like the steady drip of something that isn't quite imminent or even apparent or even big. It wasn't that. It was just the residualness of this feeling that just was pervasive and I couldn't escape it. Also, I had no joy. I had no sense of pleasure or nothing made me happy at that time, nothing. There was nothing to take me out of that except for the taste of these foods and I guess the promise that after it was also a way of like, well, now I don't have to go to class, you know? So it was this escapism of having to do the things I thought I should be doing. Yeah, I used food like that quite a bit, and I would say in those years, particularly in my earlier 20s and late teens, early 20s, actually through my 20s, food was that. Food was the effort to be anywhere but where I was and put me in a place because when I got angry at myself about eating, I had a goal. It gave me a mission and a purpose, as long as I could keep that cycle going. And that's largely what it felt like, what food was used for.
When you were having your drink and eating your granola bar, what was that moment when the actual moment of consumption? Were you walking along? Were you in Starbucks? Do you understand about what's actually going on for you in those moments?
Sometimes I'd be walking along and sometimes I'd be sitting. I have really specific memories of sitting at this moment right now. I was sitting at the window and looking out, and there was no joy in eating it. It wasn't like I was like, I'm just gonna take this moment and relish it and then get angry later. It was like every bite was like the voice in my head was, "You disgusting, hopeless." I was moving so far away from myself in those moments. Like I was doing something against my will. It really felt like that. It felt like that as much as it felt like I was doing exactly what I needed to be doing. It was this juxtaposition of like, yes, I want this, and no, I bleeping don't. And it was that conflict made me angry. You know what I mean? Because I just couldn't stop, but I couldn't not stop. And it was, I just think it fed the anger. And I think maybe that was part of my point.
Mm. The times when I was actually binging, there definitely were binges where I could be loathing myself in the middle of it. But I think a lot of the time, I know we've touched on this before, I was pretty checked out because once it was happening, it was happening. There's a thin line between acceptance and passivity. It's almost this very passive, like, oh well, this is happening. I'll come out the other side of it. And I would always convince myself that I would be able to do better. So it doesn't matter if today I completely numb out with food. It doesn't matter. It's okay because from tomorrow, I'm not going to let myself do it.
Yeah.
And really believing that and kidding myself each time. And then I would get glimpses of sort of self-awareness where I would see how I kept falling for this same trick over and over again. And in those moments, that was
Yeah.
when the despair got in. But a lot of the
Yes.
time, I think I had pretty good mental defenses in that way, which I think you have on occasion mistaken for higher self-esteem. And I'm not sure it's that. I think it's like a slight self-delusion that I could activate.
Yeah.
But it's I think it's one of the reasons why that the idea of mindful eating, the amount of times I looped back round to this idea of mindful eating, because I thought if I can just stay mindful, I won't binge. And that was true, but it felt at times impossible to stay mindful because of that desire to check out and to numb. And I think that was a big source of conflict, was this desire to numb. For a long time, I was thinking, oh, it's binge eating disorder. I'm just out of control and I have these urges to binge. And it was a bit of a shocking self-realization to see how much of me was just not willing to be more present around food.
Yeah.
It was just going, no, I want to check out. And when it noticed it was me saying, I want to check out, at that point, I felt like I couldn't blame the eating disorder anymore, because that did feel like me. That didn't necessarily feel like the eating disorder. And of course, the two were kind of, intersected as such. But there was something around a shift in willingness that started to happen just as a result of being in suffering too much. A shift of willingness to be like, I'm willing to be more present and to feel a bit more of some of these things, to figure out how to feel safe enough to feel and all of that.
Yeah. I felt like a lot of times there was an absence of an alternative. Eating was, what else was there to do to deal? Like sitting there and being mindful or being present with oneself didn't feel like enough of an action to me. It felt like, what am I supposed to do with that? It felt passive, actually. It felt, I don't want to say boring. Boring is not the right word, but it felt like not enough. And I didn't know what else could fill that intensity of emotion, I guess, that I was feeling, except food. If I had thought of, no, I don't even think so. I mean, like, if I had thought about it, like, well, if I'm present with myself, I might learn something, or I might, not have this eating disorder anymore. I don't know. I still think in the moment it was like, yeah, that's nice as a long-term goal, but my short-term goal is to not feel this way. And the only thing that's going to get me away from that, or replace the intensity of that emotion with a different one that I am more comfortable dealing with, is food. And I think that it really, truly was. Unless I always say, like, unless I had a professional, I don't know why, but massage has always been the only rivaling factor. So if I had had a professional live-in masseuse who could have been like, let me lay you down and give you I might have taken that as, that has been the only thing that has come close to me as like an acceptable alternative to binging. But as such, I didn't have that.
That comes back to your experience and your lens of looking at things through the nervous system. I think food did something to you at the nervous system level, and so did massages. Is such a physical thing.
Yes.
The nervous system stuff, to me, it makes sense now from this cognitive place, but it's not my language for describing, I think, what's going on in me. For me, a lot of it was an absence of something. It always felt like a hole. It felt like something missing. My emotions didn't feel as active as yours.
Yeah.
And I'm trying to think, like, in terms of anger is something I think that's been so stifled. For me, I would rather feel fear than anger, I think.
Can I give you my fear? I'll take your anger.
Yeah.
Well, from a nervous system point of view, I think I spend a lot of time in fight or flight, which is that active energy. And what you're talking about is an absence, which is more of a freeze, perhaps, which lends itself more to numbing.
Yeah.
I felt I needed to do something. My energy gets stuck in that fight or flight. I rarely will move into freeze. And I think maybe that's what we're talking about, is two different parts of the nervous system, and why one could feel like numbing would be more preferable to where you were in that state. Whereas for me, eating was preferable as the action. It was about the action. For you, it was about the absence.
Yeah. But sometimes I used food to get myself going. There were certainly occasions where I was drawn to binge, and I would binge, and then I could get on with things. So sometimes I would actually feel pretty good after a binge from like this mental perspective. Like my body wouldn't feel great, but it was like the conflict was gone. It was like, well, I've done it already now, but it's okay because tomorrow everything's going to be okay. I also think that might be there's perhaps a natural optimism I think that
Yeah.
doesn't always serve me in situations like that. Well, maybe it did because it did protect me, but it didn't move me forward. I think it's
Yeah.
part of what kept me stuck in the cycle.
Well, it's like it's a very protective thing to do is to imagine that tomorrow you'll be better, you'll do better, you won't do the thing. Because if you don't think that, then you land in despair, right?
Mhm.
Like if you're really seeing it then and that feeling is like you'd rather delude yourself. I think that's a psychological defense that we just aren't even in charge of. You know, that's something that we'll do to protect ourselves and make ourselves feel better about the numbing out,
Yeah.
about the only thing we can do to cope with this thing.
If you want connection and support around any of the topics we talk about on the podcast, we would love for you to join our membership community.
Members have access to monthly online support groups, a private Facebook group, live episode recordings, and member-only Q&As.
If you would like to join us, please head to lifeafterdietspodcast.com/community.
Now let's get back to the episode.
Where do you start with clients who might come to you and say, I use food to numb?
Well, so I think that where it depends on the type of numbing, to be honest. I think that if it's numbing like me, where it's that active escapism, that's a different thing than someone where you're describing where there's more of that absence. So the first thing I'll ask people to do is to notice when that is happening. And I think in this episode, it might be worthwhile talking about how we know it's happening because creating the awareness around that. And then that's why I have WhatsApp built into my programs. So it's kind of like these are the moments I would like a client to reach out to me in that moment, because then there's connection. And when you have connection with someone and you know that someone's there to listen and you're not bothering somebody, that connection is part of a different part of your nervous system, actually, that brings you to a completely different state. So in order to interrupt that state, I like to use connection. And so, and honestly, it takes for people who are really in the thick of this and like, I don't want to, I understand that too. Like, I don't want to connect at that time. It's not something I'm going to do. So we work a lot on developing the desire to want to connect. And I check in a lot. So I try to intervene in real time as much as possible, like, on a day where this is going on, to sort of break the pattern of numbing out and staying in that numbed out space. So even if it's after the fact, just at least like toggling between that I'm way out here, and then I'm coming back to the connection and to self. That's part of that pattern breaking.
I'm now thinking of the link and the idea of numbing and avoidance, because that I think was a big part of it for me, would have been that whole, I don't want to think about how I'm feeling. I don't want to, I don't even know if it wasn't as conscious as that. It wasn't as
Yeah.
decision making as that. Back then, I could easily fall into these patterns of behavior and kind of think I was doing okay because I wasn't really aware of anything I was feeling. And then I think I somatize my feelings. So I think then I get sick and I have aches and pains in certain places and I carry stiffness in my body. I feel like my body then holds it. And that has been such a huge part of my work, personal development work, even over the last year, is to become more embodied. And
Yeah.
I know sometimes on this podcast, it sounds like, I'm just, every time I get a feeling, I'm sitting down and I'm checking it out and I'm doing all of this. But so much of that is now part of my routine to do that in the evenings and in the mornings, because if I don't know if I ever would. And
Yeah.
then I think I'm worried I'm going to miss something really important. I think that's why I become so hyper vigilant about like, what's that? Am I feeling something? Where is it in my body?
Yeah.
What's going on? I accept you. I feel you. I welcome.
Yeah.
Welcome all feelings.
I don't want you to feel rejected.
What's the story here? Let me question my story.
I think what you're bringing up is a good point, and I see this a lot too, is repetitive numbing will show up somatically with pain, particularly with pain or digestive distress and things like that. The body will take that on, which is why I think somatic work is at one time something I completely eye rolled over, but is
Me
now
too.
something I see as integral. And honestly, sometimes if you're someone listening who resonates with the numbing out, somatic practices are a way. They're not going to like stop your binging. in and of themselves, but they're absolutely a way to start moving into connection and what I would call a validation of the nervous system, where you might say it's validating your feelings. But there's this it's going in and saying, I see you, I hear you, like I'm checking in with you. It's also you could also look at that as an inner child work, right? Like that there's something that's been numbed out enough to the point where it's feeling rejected and like that there is something in there that we're numbing, which means by definition that we're like, no, you go back to your little corner, which can manifest as pain or whatever. And it's kind of like saying, like, I'm going to check in with you regularly. I'm going to develop a practice of checking with you regularly. And for some clients, I'll do this in session, and it's the only time somebody would do it because, and I'm like that. Like, unless I have to do it, I generally wouldn't have. So I'll have people do it in session so that we're getting more used to what it even is like to do it. What does it mean? Like, what do you do? And at least even if it's just once a week, or through a WhatsApp conversation or something like that. Like it's a practice of saying like I'm going to go in and say hello. And I think that's part of healing.
So to come back to your suggestion earlier around helping people to understand or recognize if numbing
Yeah.
is something that's happening for them, I think to get clear on how we're talking about numbing now, from what we're talking about here, when you describe what was going on for you at, I was going to say Tesco for some reason, then Starbucks, that switched from one feeling into this very active, like angry feeling. That's not how I think of numbing.
Right.
How I would draw the line with numbing is it's about feeling less of, and I know it's a change in emotional state and it might be something a bit different. But what I can say is how, in the times when I think I was using food to numb, I felt less after I ate and during than I did before. There was like a quietening down.
So
And
interesting.
that, I don't know what your thoughts are on that, but in terms of how we are understanding this whole concept of using food to numb, what do you
Yeah,
think?
I think I agree. I think that's how we would be using it. And I think you're more equipped to talk about it because I think that's something that was much more active for you and worked well for you, or it worked at all.
Yeah. And so for me, there's a difference between, and so to speak to the listener, there's a difference, I think, between using food for relief and using food to feel less of. So, for example, if you are restricting and you're having that kind of reactive binging, chances are, you know, depending on what your emotional and psychological response is, there could be some relief that comes through binging because, like, the body's wanting food and the mind's wanting food. And that was a different state, the way I understand it, from eating in a way to feel, what am I saying? Eating in a different way to feel or to not feel.
Well, here. So how did you know when you were eating for that reason, for the numbing reason?
I didn't know. I'm trying to figure this out in hindsight. The kind of feelings that I was finding intolerable was despair and shame, I think. Despair that nothing would change, and just the shame and agitation of having to be me. So when I was trying to avoid despair and when I was trying to or avoid shame as well, that for me might have been more of a numbing. I don't know. That's not helpful to people. Like, I don't know what I'm saying.
Well, okay, let me ask it a different way. How did it look behaviorally when you would start eating to numb? Would it be happening? How would your day be going? What's how did it begin and how did it transpire?
It would be less frantic, and I want to use the word sudden as other kinds of perhaps deprivation triggered binging. Numbing was almost a ritualistic thing. It was a case of I've got this empty time. I
Okay.
can't bear the thought of this empty time.
So empty
And
time
so,
is a clue.
yes, empty
Okay.
time. And so it's a case of let me just fill this space so that I get to the point where either it's time to go to bed or maybe it's time for something else to happen and then life starts happening again. It was almost in these gaps of life.
Yeah.
I was like, I
Okay.
can't bear these gaps. I can't bear these gaps. I just want to like shut off, shut down, pretend they're not happening. I'll eat my way through them and then I will come out when there is something to come out for. That was part of it. I think the stronger the urge was to not pay attention, that I think was another one for me anyway. This is retrospectively trying to understand this around numbing. So if there was part of me that just And it's that whole television again, television and food, that combination of those 2 things kind of lulled me into this numb, zoned out state, maybe even comforted to some degree, which again, it's really hard, isn't it, to put something in a box and go like, "This was numbing," and it was only numbing.
Right.
Like, there was
Yeah.
numbing going on, but then maybe there was also comfort going on, and maybe there was also
Right.
some kind of regulation going on as well. So I'm just thinking of numbing as, "I don't want to feel this.
Okay.
This is so unbearable for me, and I don't even know why," and that's what makes it
Yeah.
more unbearable, is the not knowing
Yes.
why.
Can I ask, when those so you're saying when you had these gaps of life, which I wanna get back to because I really resonate with that, um, but would it be like, "Okay, here's this gap, here's this time period, I'm gonna binge and it's big?" Or is it like, I'm just gonna have some chips, and then I'm gonna have" did it look the same every time? Were the behaviors noticeable as far as, like, it would start out as grazing and then it would turn into a binge? Or was it like I'm ready to get out of here, I need a binge?"
I think most of the time I knew before I began eating, this is a binge, and I
Okay,
wouldn't even be kidding myself. It would just be a
okay,
case of gathering everything together and being like, "Okay, this is happening now. I am going offline," 'cause that's what it was like.
okay,
It was this going offline,
yeah.
which might have been different to talk about travel binges. Like, I used to binge all the time on trains, tubes, in the
Yes.
car, that kind of thing.
Airports.
So that might not be numbing so much because that felt much more like circumstance triggered, if you like. Maybe it would be. Now I'm thinking
Yeah,
about it,
but
it could
it's
fall into that category. It's
they're
another gap of
gaps.
time.
Yeah, they're those
Mm.
transition gaps. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
Oh, I resonate with that. I used to
yeah,
binge, oh, in airports all the time.
yeah.
Waiting. I binged waiting. I binged waiting for events. I've talked about this. Like, I would have a dinner planned and I couldn't wait. And I used to actually, when I was in my 20s and going out with my girlfriends, like we used to go out all the time, like Thursday, Friday, Saturday nights. This is at a time when I would go out. And those hours between like 3 p.m. and the time we went out, I used to ask my friends, be like, "What do we do? What do we do? What are you doing right now? What do you do with yourself?" Before that, those unless I had something to do, I didn't know what to do. Um, this is more of that existential talk. I think there's something very I like what you said about, like, you didn't even know why. That's what it felt
Mm.
like. It wasn't always clear. Like, "Oh, I'm not uncomfortable with this existential feeling of gap." Like, it's like, no, it's like, "And I just don't like it. It's the way this feels, but nothing's wrong." You know what I mean? And I think that when you were just talking about numbing that in that way, I think that I did have numbing experiences with food, but it wasn't in the acute binge way. It was more of in a it's just the middle of the afternoon. Absolutely nothing's wrong. There's nothing I even have to necessarily do right now, but I just feel like I'm gonna have a little snack, and I'm just telling myself it's a little snack, and then I'm just gonna have another little snack 'cause I think I just need a different texture now, and then and that would catapult into this grazy type. You would either stay as graziness, or it would turn into a graze gone binge, and that was more numbing for me, and that was less of the anger and more of the fear. So to me, this was more of the, like, "I don't know what to do with this, like, I don't know what this even is." I wasn't even aware that it wasn't. I wasn't even aware. Again, retrospectively looking at it, I just know it was a discomfort. But this still will exist sometimes, in terms of what that feeling is. Like, there are times in especially unstructured time, like weekends this past week, having had off for Christmas break as we record this, it was just a week ago. And there was a lot of time that was not mine per se, like, I couldn't do with what I wanted with it. I couldn't go read a book if I'd wanted to, which would have been another form of, like, escape. But I had to take care of the kids, and there was things I had to do, and it just felt like nothing's wrong right now. I'm just, like, making the coffee for tomorrow, and then I have nothing to do after that, and I'm not really except for I have to be here for the kids, and I don't really wanna play right now. So it's just like, I don't like how this feels. So, like, it's just that would have been a time when I would have gone into my pantry and "Oh, have a little this, have a" and not to say that I didn't, but it would have turned into something else, whereas this time I was able to name this almost every day and say like, "Oh, I'm in that funk." I would call it a funk. I think on my stories I posted, "I'm in that no man's land vibe. I'm having a no man's land vibe," or something like that, and it just named it. But I didn't use food to numb me out of it. I just was I think because we've done so much talking about naming so many things, now it's a lot easier to have awareness and to say like, "Oh, this is that. This is what I'm dealing with right now." And that once you name it, for me, there's less fear about it. It doesn't feel like this thing that's like getting at you and you don't even know what it is or why or where. It's still like, oh yeah, it's that. I see it. And that I can deal with.
Mhm. As you're talking, what's coming up for me, I think one of the things that I couldn't cope with was messing up. And it only really came to my notice with food. It was my mid-20s when I started binge eating, so there was a life before that. And I don't remember that being an issue because I'd always seen myself as the kind of person of, "Oh, if I want to do this thing, I'll just do this thing," and I did it. And I think when it came to food, it was like the first thing that I couldn't just decide I was going to do this way and be able to do it. And so there was like there was that fragility in me actually of not having gone through like, I don't know, some trials or things to make me gritty, you know? I just would fall apart. And it came to mind when you were talking about the craziness and the going back and forth that it could start like that, but it would switch very fast because it would be a case of, okay, I'll have this one snack, have this snack, feel a bit bad about it, then have another one, and then boom, catastrophic thinking comes in.
Yeah.
And that catastrophic thinking, which was accompanied by all the catastrophic feelings, was like, I have to get out of this. And I know I can't get it right now because I've already got it wrong. So I need to go offline for a bit
Yeah. Yeah.
and come back in new.
Yeah. That would just kill my day though. There was
Mm.
no coming back after that. I'm conscious that we're at time and we didn't get to restriction as numbing. And so perhaps if that's of interest to listeners, you might let us know because I could talk about that ad infinitum. Um, but what to take away from what we have discussed?
What's become apparent at this point, which I hadn't really thought about at the beginning of the conversation, is there's very few examples where I can look at and think it was just numbing. It was just about numbing. It's so much more complex to this. We're talking about a change in state, whereas numbing is about not feeling anything.
Mm,
And this just ties in with the whole waves and patterns of emotions that I'm not even sure that I agree that numbing is the right word anymore.
yeah.
Heard it here first, guys. Doesn't exist. It's just something. If I were to just put it as a question like this, then, how has it been possible for you not to use food to numb in this way? What is different now about how you approach things like fear, that's still a
Mhm.
super challenging emotion, that makes it possible for you not to go to the food? Because that's probably the key that people are trying to work out for themselves.
Yeah. And I think that's an excellent question. And I can only answer it personally. I don't think it will apply to everybody. But for me, taking restriction away, taking that out of the equation was huge for me to get out of the swings, violent swings. So I'm not saying that when I stopped restricting, I didn't still use food in this way of numbing or translating an emotion to something more tolerable, but it was less violent. It was less extreme. It didn't happen in the dire, catastrophic ways that it did happen prior. Um, from there, it became, for me, regulation, nervous system regulation, because it was that, and that's again my language, so you might think of it differently. But for me, it was recognizing the ways in which something intolerable to me would trigger in my system a sense of fear and a sense of like, this isn't okay. And the more I started to go in, become, pay more attention to my body and learn how to calm my body, the more I could confront having an existential despair and not feel terrified of that, so that I was more willing to name it and to say I can move through this because I know how to calm my body down. I think having these feelings all my life had been so terrifying and so dysregulating because of that fear of them that I would need to get out. And the need to get out has significantly decreased. It's not to say I don't have the feelings and that food wouldn't be a welcome sort of way of helping myself, but I don't need it to the degree that I used to because I'm simply not as dysregulated by it.
For me, the biggest part of it was acceptance, accepting my foibles and messiness and limitations, I think was a big one because I didn't want to accept that I couldn't control this thing. So I fought against that a lot. Accepting my body, accepting non perfection, and people go, okay, well, yeah, how are you supposed to accept this thing that I hate so much?
We've got a
Like,
course for that.
I
Not yet, though.
was going to say, have we? Did you finish it off? Oh,
Go
thanks.
on template.
We'll get around to creating it. Yeah. For me, it was really coming to this idea of, first of all, am I willing to accept? Because I believe that we have free will. But I thought that free will used to mean I should just be able to tell myself I'm going to do this thing because I have free will and that should make me do it. And actually realizing that free will is much more about willingness than necessarily being able to do the action. So one was a case of, am I willing to accept the reality of how things are in this moment? And acceptance doesn't mean that nothing changes. And then coming back to this idea, what are the actual advantages of accepting the things we can't control? Well, we're really talking about things we can't control. So one aspect was being humble enough to say, I can't control this. I fought against that for a long time. Once I got to that point, the acceptance part of, am I willing to accept the things I can't control? Well, I can try not accepting them, but that doesn't mean that I then get to control them anyway. I just heap more suffering on this thing that's already painful. So I think that was really helpful for me to be able to tolerate being in the gaps of life with myself when I wasn't doing or producing or in some way being value. I'd really equated my value with productivity and how people saw me. And those are a couple of the things that I dismantled my stories and values around. For the most part, they can
Okay.
creep in.
Thank you.
They
Thank
can
you.
creep in.
Okay.
But they were controlling everything, so I became much more aware.
Okay.
I can manage them.
Thank you.
That way.
I was like, can we just jump into a whole nother episode about that? Because I was thinking to myself, I think I still have some of my value attached to those things, but not to the degree. Anyway. All right, Sarah. Good
Okay,
episode.
so- Even if we do say so ourselves.
All right, everyone. See you next week.
See you next week.